across 17 European countries, worth more than 10 billion euros. We need also to achieve the same ambition in the field of hydrogen. There is absolutely no doubt that Europe is leading the way in research and development in this very field. But the projects we have carried out so far have not yet led to industrial leadership. And let's be clear, if we lose any more time, it will be our current competitors, the United States, China, Korea, Japan, who will sell us their products. But I am far from pessimistic. We have a unique opportunity to shape the future of the hydrogen economy. But to do this, we also need to make the best use of existing decarbonized energy. I am, as you may guess, referring to nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is available, abundant, and cheap today. We should use this transitional energy to facilitate the deployment of a clean hydrogen industry in Europe now. In concrete terms, I'm talking about using existing nuclear reactors exclusively for the one at the end of their life to run electrolyzer and thus produce clean hydrogen, of course, in full compliance with all safety standards. This will also allow a new sector to emerge while waiting for sufficient renewable energy to become available. The promotion of clean hydrogen is typically the kind of disruptive project around which Europeans can come together. But there are other examples, particularly in the digital sector. Connected cars, smartphones, 5G, cloud, Internet of Things, edge. Semiconductors are at the heart of the digital and green transformation of our industry and economy. Yet, Europe has dropped from a 40% market share in the 90s to 10% today. And we urgently need to reposition Europe in this critical technology. This is absolutely essential to avoid exposing our industrial ecosystems as we are seeing with the current shortage of semiconductors. I'm thinking, of course, of the automotive industry. Several of our production plants simply had to shut down because of a lack of components. And 10% of this year's demand may not be met. This example fully illustrates the meaning and importance of what we call technological sovereignty or autonomy. Without it, we will remain too exposed to the ups and downs of the world. The same applies to data, which undoubtedly marks the beginning of a new industrial revolution. The mastery of data processing, storage sharing, and of related IT technologies, in particular the cloud and the edge, will play a decisive role in implementation of our ambition for our industry and, of course, for our single market. These are all issues that the new alliances on microprocessors and industrial data will have to tackle head-on in order to yield concrete projects. Because industrial alliances are a concrete and operational lever to bring together all the players in our value chains in order to identify, shape, and accomplish the most innovative and structuring projects. They also enable partners to be mobilized around important projects of common European interest. This mechanism facilitates the emergence of disruptive, multi-country projects where the market cannot do it alone and which can benefit from public funding. They also allow SMEs now and innovative startups to take part in adventures that go beyond their usual field of activity. As you see, the European Commission is deploying its entire industrial toolbox. But that is not enough. We must also equip ourselves with a regulatory arsenal that helps to turn our industrial ambition into reality. Few examples. I mentioned data just now. we recently proposed a regulation on European data governance. With this proposal, we are defining an alternative model to that of integrated platforms, a governance model that is more likely to establish real trust. We will complement this proposal with an initiative at the end of this year to promote data sharing between companies and between companies and public authorities. In the field of artificial intelligence, we tabled proposals in April to reinforce Europe's leadership position for safe, inclusive, trustworthy, and human-centered artificial intelligence. Beyond digital, the EU has put a new mechanism in place to safeguard the Union's interest in the most strategic sectors, the Foreign Direct Investment Screening Mechanism, which has been operational since the end of last year. In the same spirit, the Commission has proposed to better control foreign subsidies in acquisition and public procurement to make sure that all companies compete on an equal footing in our own single market. Finally, we will soon present a new standardization strategy. In French, we say « qui fait la norme détient le marché ». In other words, who makes the standards holds the markets. And this is what we did over 30 years ago with the GSM standard for mobile phone. But we lost ground. And if we want to ensure Europe's technological sovereignty in crucial disruptive sectors, such as 5G, batteries, hydrogen, or quantum technologies, we must occupy the field of standard setting. We must become standard makers and not just standard takers. We are not a market. We are a continent. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to conclude by returning to the question we are being asked today. Which team is Europe playing for? To answer this question, I would like to take the example of what we did and are doing in the field of vaccines. In a few months, we have succeeded in ramping up Europe's industrial capacities, more than 55 factories, in record time. This is an incredible achievement. Let's not be afraid to admit it. Europe is now not only the world's leading producer of vaccines, but also because this, too, must be remembered. We export half of our production to the rest of the world. So in short, Team Europe is playing for its fellow citizens, but also playing for Team World. Because while we must look after the future of our fellow Europeans, we also have a responsibility toward the international community. A duty of solidarity, a duty of sharing, a duty of fairness. And this is particularly true for science and technology. Technological geopolitics is like a mountain range where our values and our interests meet, where soft power that characterizes us meet a new hard power. A hard power that we also want to infuse the European Union with to establish ourselves as a partner, but one that is proud of its strengths and ready to defend them in a fiercely competitive global scene. I am convinced that Europe can walk this ridge with confidence. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Breton. Vamos a continuar con el panel. Vamos a tener ahora unas ponencias muy breves de las tres.
We will have some brief interventions of the three speakers, and then we will go on to the panel session and the discussion, which will be the most interesting part of all this. And the Commissioner has talked about hydrogen,
y también de inteligencia artificial, Karma, que de eso quién mejor que tú ahora, para situarnos en qué situación está España y Europa para todos estos desafíos que nos ha comentado el señor comisario.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting session and
Muchísimas gracias por invitarme a esta sesión tan importante sobre geopolítica.
I would say that first of all, we all realize that technology, innovation, and digitalization are shaping a new global order, and it's undeniable that the technology change already is permeating all aspects of politics and economy. And I would mention three main areas where this is affecting. First of all, on power relations between nation states and non-state members, that's big digital companies. Second, on the economic and social model. And third, on individual rights and freedoms. So technology has not only changed the nature of power, but also the balance and distribution among the states. The first wave of digitalization and digital platform was clearly led by the United States. Now we're witnessing a second wave, which is still under construction, basically on AI, 5G networks, and quantum technologies that is mostly led by China, with having the United States very close. And Europe cannot afford being just a silent witness between these two main forces. And because we have a third way. We don't accept the existing technology evolution model that US is proposing, when mostly private and digital multinational companies are leading the control of data, for example. We say that in the United States, data is in the hands of the companies, while in China, data is in the hands of the governments. No, we want a third way. We say data is in the hands of citizens, and that's what we want to propose to the rest of the world. And this is why I think that the evolution of technology is not going to be homogeneous all over the world. But when we talk about European sovereignty, we need to claim that Europe has a different way. It has a different model to propose to the rest of the world. And this is why we must work together in a united vision to propose this third way. We must become an important player and with an ethical perspective. So we want to propose to the rest of the world is that technology development is possible with maintaining European principles and values. It's not going to be easy, but it is, I think, the most important contribution we make to the world. And as Mr. Breton said, I also think that the world geopolitics is not longer valid. We should talk about GCS politics, which is geo, cyber, and space politics. We can no longer preserve our citizen rights, just limiting our action to a geopolitical sphere. We see that at the cybersecurity. I say that we can no longer talk about cybersecurity. We should talk about cyber defense, and that requires international coordination. There was a visit of Mr. Biden in Europe, also was pointing in the same direction, and because technologies are also critical for national security. On the economical model, we are moving from an industrial model to a data model. And the reason why Europe was not leading this last decade is because we were not looking at the right place. We were just suffering the economic crisis starting in 2010, and we were just devoting all the efforts saving our industry, our traditional industry. But at the same time, there was a new movement on digital technological sector where we were not leaders at that time. But this doesn't mean that we cannot recover that leadership, and the European industry transformation is, of course, a digital transformation. We also remind that the distribution of power is not the same for all the states, but non-state actors are really have a lot of power. And one of the other contributions that Europe has always made to the world is regulating global markets. So from Europe, we are regulating global markets, and we're doing so now, as Mr. Breton said, with the Data Act, but also the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, and also with the European Regulation on Artificial Intelligence. So I think that when we talk about recovering European digital sovereignty, that means that we can propose an alternative model, and that's the battle for the model, not the battle for the technology. So that's for introduction. I think it's enough.
Thank you very much, Carmen. There are many issues for Ulrike
Gracias,
to
Karma.
comment.
Hay
Some of them
muchas
we were
razones
discussing them yesterday
para
at night during dinner. How
muchos
difficult it
elementos
was
que
to
podemos
name
comentar.
things
Ayer
that
hablamos de
don't
lo
even
difícil
exist yet.
que era hablar y tomar
So
decisiones sobre
please,
cosas que aún no
chance.
existen.
Thank you so
Te cedo
much,
la
Marta,
palabra.
and thanks
Muchísimas
very much
gracias,
for
Marta,
having me
y
here
muchísimas gracias
in
por
Spain.
haberme
It's fun to be able
invitado
to travel
a
again, so
España.
that's
Es
great.
maravilloso el poder viajar de nuevo.
So
Es
I
fantástico.
work for the European Council on Foreign Relations, and I lead what we call our Technology in European Power Initiative. And I thought I'll kick us off with maybe kind of pointing out or sharing with you 4 observations that I've made through my work, and they're loosely oriented along some of the questions that were asked to this panel. So the first question I wanted to address is very much follows what we just heard from our distinguished first speaker. Is this question of, why has technology all of a sudden become so important? Why are we talking about this now? Because after all, there's always been, and there hopefully will always be technological development. This is actually a continuous process. And there are some area of governments, most importantly I would say the military, that actually has always had a focus on technological development. But although technological development is continuous, it isn't uniform. So there are always moments when things start to speed up, when they start to change more, when they arguably become revolutionary. And arguably this is happening now with a range of technologies, and this is always tricky in these panels, right? We speak about technologies, disruptive technologies, new technologies, emerging technologies, what does this even entail? And I work a lot on artificial intelligence, but there are so many other things that were even already mentioned on this panel. But I think what's happening now is that a lot of things are coming together and really kind of influencing each other too. But maybe more importantly, I think what's happening right now is that we already have crossed the threshold where all of this becomes really relevant for geopolitics, for international politics. And Marta was referring to the new Cold War, and Thierry Bertrand was talking about an acute awareness of geostrategic balance. I think that's all correct. So what exactly is happening? There are many different ways to try and kind of classify these changes that we're seeing. In a recent paper with Nacho Torreblanca, who's here, a colleague of mine, we actually said that what's happening is that these technologies are creating new dependencies, geopolitically speaking, and they're creating new ways of interference, geopolitically speaking. But that's relatively abstract, so maybe let's just break this down to kind of 3 more concrete examples, and these are 3, but there can be more. But I think what's worth looking at is how technology is currently influencing geopolitics in these 3 ways. So the first is what we're clearly seeing is that technology is, or our technologies are promising new economic gains, right? I mean, we see this in particular in China, but also elsewhere. When countries gain more economically, this translates almost directly into geopolitical power. So that's one development. The second development, which was alluded briefly in the beginning, is what we're seeing, a shift of power from the state to the private sector, right? From the state to private corporations. This isn't something that we've never seen before. I mean, think the oil boom and all of this, but it's certainly an interesting and important geopolitical development. And then third, because this is something I primarily work on and find really important, we are also seeing the impact on new technologies in the military realm. And new technologies are bolstering some actors, and some actors are becoming stronger through military power that's enabled by, for example, artificial intelligence, and others kind of see their relative strength.
Otros cuya fuerza se va perdiendo. Así que la tecnología se ha convertido en un elemento geopolítico y este es el mensaje principal. Europa y la Unión Europea poco a poco están siendo conscientes de ello. Hace un año, año y medio hubiese dicho no estamos hablando de esto y solo tenemos en cuenta la lente económica y social para todo esto, pero creo que ahora las cosas han cambiado. Y esto me lleva al segundo punto, intentando responder a otra de las preguntas que se plantean sobre si
technological development and the geopolitical technological development. And I'm sure you've all seen these like really gloomy predictions, right? I mean, you know, McKinsey says we're falling behind on technology. The Boston Consulting Group says there's a widening digital gap between Europe and the US. Kai-Fu Lee, you may have read his books. He famously says that Europe is not even running in the bronze medal on artificial intelligence. The thing is, I've been working on this for quite a long time, and funnily enough, I can't even tell you whether this is necessarily correct because there's so much data missing on what Europe is even able to do. I kind of feel that we often forget that, you know, Europe and the European Union is quite a few countries. You know, the EU is 27 countries. And when you look at all of these, you know, rankings and classifications, basically they only look at, you know, Germany, France, UK, even though it's not longer in the EU, and then maybe Spain, maybe Italy, and then maybe some outliers like, you know, Estonia. But there is literally no data on, for example, you know, how good the EU really is on artificial intelligence, you know, across the continent. And I always find this really striking because it's so easy to find so many different, you know, research projects and data collections on exactly that question when it comes to the US or to China, but almost not on Europe. So basically what I keep telling, especially an audience from the European Union, is that actually what we first of all need is some more data and more mapping. And there are two things that I would love the European Union to do. Number one, kind of following the US example, I think we need a European Security Commission on AI. You may have seen that there's a US Security Commission on AI that put out this 700 plus pages report recently. I think we need something similar with representatives from the different EU member states and from the private sector that kind of, you know, can in a way do some stock taking and also develop some strategies. And what we also need is simply more research and a kind of research hub in Europe. Those of you who kind of know a little bit about AI may know that in the US there's a relatively new institute at Georgetown University that does a lot of work on AI and geopolitics, and I keep thinking that we need something similar in Europe and in Brussels. But let me briefly turn to my third and then fourth point. So one of the other questions was whether we need or should have European technological sovereignty. And overall, I definitely think that this is the right approach and a good idea. Personally, I think the biggest challenge on this will not necessarily be our relationship with China, but our relationship with the United States. There can be no equidistance between China and the US for Europe, and of course the United States is our closest partner, but that also means, you know, that we need to discuss a few things. And I think that there are some genuine disagreements in some areas where the EU and the US may have to agree to disagree. And I'm just going to pick one example, again, an AI example. We've just heard about Trustworthy AI, right? The EU has really made Trustworthy AI one of its main points of areas of work, which I think is absolutely right. I think this approach is good for humankind, because I genuinely believe that it would be good if we developed Trustworthy AI and if this was adopted throughout the world. But this can also be basically a location advantage for Europe and for the European Union. If AI made in Europe is considered particularly trustworthy and particularly good, that's something that's, well, economically good for the EU. Which, however, means that we have kind of two different interests here, right? On the one hand, we absolutely want to work with the US in order to kind of diffuse this idea as far as possible. But on the other hand, we also kind of want to keep a certain element of this to ourselves, because again, it can be an advantage for Europe. And I think these are the kind of questions we need to ask ourselves. How do we work with the US so that it, you know, we have a positive development for everyone, and where do we where don't we necessarily work with the US, also because they may have different approaches, because it may be in our interest not to do so. And then just very briefly, kind of let me end with a thought about the role of Spain and the role of member states, the EU member states in general. I think that member states actually really matter in this context. This is not just something that can be done or should be done by the EU and Brussels. So where are the member states at the moment? If I had to rank the member states on the basis of my work, which I don't claim is going to be completely comprehensive, but just to kind of give you a sense of where I see this. When it comes to seeing technology and artificial intelligence as a particular geopolitical topic, I'd say in Europe, France is leading in this thinking. We've just heard Thierry Breton, who arguably works for an EU institution, but I think we've seen the French national artificial intelligence strategy. We've seen a military AI strategy being published by France. I think they adopted a very geopolitical mindset when it comes to technology. There are a few other countries, the Netherlands, interesting enough, that is kind of thinking along this line as well. And from what I can tell, Spain is actually, picking up this topic quite a bit, and there's a new tech diplomacy report that's in the making and things like that. So I think this is a very good development. And my hunch in a way is that this may be because Spain has these very important links to Latin America, to South America, where we can very much see the impact, for example, of China and Chinese technology firms in the region. But yeah, so many countries, to be honest, so many member states in the EU aren't really thinking about these topics, aren't really there yet. And I actually think, this could be a lose-lose situation if the member states don't work on this, but it would be a win-win if the EU and the member states work together. I think what we're currently maybe seeing is that the member states kind of feel the geopolitical questions, because these are very big questions that are relevant to the EU, are the EU responsibility. However, at the same time, the EU, because it doesn't really do geopolitics, despite some recent rhetoric, but overall doesn't really do geopolitics, isn't necessarily focused on this either. And so, I worry a bit about this. I think this could be dangerous. I think the EU needs to prove its approach in the member states. We can't leave vacuums in the member states. The EU needs the member states' connection and partners. And so the cooperation between Brussels and the national capitals, I think here is particularly important. And we can't leave this to the Brussels institutions. So I'll stop here to kind of conclude the 4 points I just kind of wanted to throw in this discussion. So again, technology is so important now, I think, because it has crossed this threshold of geopolitical relevance, and we have new dependencies, new vulnerabilities, new possibility of interference, but also new opportunities, of course. Europe is working on this more, but even more is needed. And again, we really need more data and more research on this before we even can, have policy prescriptions. Third, European technological sovereignty is a good approach, and we will need to work hard on the relationship with the US, which is the most crucial. And then fourth, as I just said, the member states are needed. Brussels cannot and should not do this by itself. So involving everyone, involving Madrid is a very good idea. And I'll stop here because I already overran.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. Now is Anu's time. You've been mentioning how relevant the US position on it is. I'm sure she can help us to understand it. Thanks very much. Anu, it's your turn.
Martha, thank you so much. And really, thank you for the invitation. This is really a terrific conversation. So I am grateful for the remarks by Ulrike and Belén, and share many of the views that they have expressed. But let me also start by answering the question that we were posed, meaning whose team is the EU playing in? And here I would use exactly the framing that you used, Belén, that we cannot be choosing between the United States or China. It is not an option for the EU. The EU has a very different vision that is worth defending. And it cannot be forced to choose between the American techno-libertarian vision that leaves a lot of power to the markets and private corporations, but it also certainly cannot be relying on the vision advanced by China, which is a very much of a digital authoritarian vision that relies on control and surveillance and very much contradicts with the European view, which is rights-focused, rights-centric, much more digital humanitarian view, where we think about fairness of the marketplace, where we think about the ethics of the AI, and where we think about democracy and individual rights and internet as the medium to enhance rather than undermine those freedoms. So it's imperative that the EU lays its own path forward and takes control over its own digital destiny. And also I would say that how Commissioner Breton framed this, it would also be good for the team world. And I don't think the rest of the world wants to necessarily choose between an American model or the Chinese model, and Europeans have a lot to offer. So the fact that this is important, the question is whether it is feasible. And there I would want to debunk another myth, which is that the EU is not strong enough to choose. And here I would start from the strength that the EU has and the biggest element of its digital sovereignty, which is its role as the regulator of the world. So the EU is not at the mercy of choices by the others. The EU can shape the rules of the game and the environment within which technologies are developed and deployed. So let me pause and say that that is very, very important. But at the same time, I do want to mention that that alone is not enough. And I have, even though I'm a big proponent and a speaker of the EU's regulatory power and the importance of that power, I also very much want to endorse the idea that the EU should not just be the referee for these teams, but the EU needs to play the game, get on the field, and it needs to play offense and it needs to play defense. So in many ways, I think the EU has woken up and it is doing that. And the Commissioner Breton's overview of the various initiatives really shows a much more assertive Europe. So if we think about some of these offensive strategies, the massive investments in whether we talk about batteries or semiconductors or European cloud, or then also a recognition of the importance of artificial intelligence and the investments that the EU needs to make in that. So those are all strategies where the EU has the opportunity to build more capabilities and reduce its dependencies from other regions of the world, whether it's the reliance of American companies on storing the European data in a cloud, or whether it is reliance on Chinese on the key raw materials needed for batteries, or then the production of semiconductors, for instance. But also then the defensive strategies. For instance, I am very much welcoming the new regulation, the proposals on controlling foreign subsidies that are often used to, for instance, fuel tech acquisitions, government procurement, and they're otherwise distorting market competition. The same way that we need to control that through national security review of the foreign direct investment, so that key technology assets in Europe will not be lightly be given to the hands of the foreign ownership. So there's certainly space for an assertive strategy. But we need to be very mindful when we are entering this terrain of a more geopolitical technology game. The Europe is not necessarily playing to its strengths. When we talk about the importance of cybersecurity, for instance, we talk about cyber sanctions. These are geopolitical tools that require unanimity. This is very difficult for Europe to harness. It's one of those areas where a lot of mistakes can be made. Mistakes in particular when we are conducting industrial policy without being absolutely certain that European governments, for instance, know how to pick winners, making sure that we are not wasting the public funds when we are pursuing a very big investments, or just fueling global subsidy races, because we are not the only ones that are looking to support, for instance, semiconductors or batteries. The Americans are playing the same game now as well. China is famous for the amount of state support that it is lending to these industries. So this alone may not be a path to victory, and it may also not be an example of how Europeans should be and could be playing to their strengths. So I am not saying that we should not be investing in these big industrial projects. What I am warning against is this idea of fueling more of a protectionist industrial policy agenda, which will not be the path, in my view, towards greater digital sovereignty or competitiveness of the European industry. And here I would also warn the Europeans that don't underestimate the power of the Brussels effect, which has served Europe well in advancing the European vision and spreading the European regulations across the world. But it can also be an effective tool to start spreading more protectionist regulations. So if Europe opts for data localization, if Europe starts converting the merger control, for instance, to a tool for industrial policy, starts to build European national champions, guarantee that the others will look to Europe to do the same. And that is not the world that Europe wants to build when it comes to open digital economy. So I take great both, I would say that Commissioner Breton's remarks today and earlier are both a tremendous source of hope for me in terms of articulating the European ambition, but they also give me some pause and concern if we do not implement that ambition in a way that remains true to the European values and commitment to economic openness. So let me maybe lay out in closing a few other elements of European technological power where I believe that Europe really should be focusing on if it wants to be not just a regulator, but the producer of these technologies. And the first is that the ultimate source of European power is the single market. And it needs to keep a laser focus in completing the digital single market. That is ultimately, I think, the most important thing to do. The second is that it needs to complete the Capital Markets Union. One of the biggest reasons that European companies are not growing to the size of the tech giants in America is that you cannot raise the funding in Europe. So that is one of the most important reasons why innovative European startups get acquired by the American tech companies. So Capital Markets Union is also very high on my agenda. Third, if I mention, is that there is a way that American innovation culture rewards risk-taking, which is very critical when you try to do really something transformative. And for instance, the bankruptcy laws in Europe often makes a failure a fatal one, where you cannot then raise funds and try again. Whereas the American system thinks, well, if you do fail, sometimes when you just try hard enough, but that is never fatal. So we could be rewriting our bankruptcy laws, which can be much more important than trying to just put more and more billions into some kind of a global subsidy race. Another issue that I would want to focus on that we often don't see on the agenda when we talk about the European technology power is that if you think about what the source of American innovation is, it is not all American innovators. It is a lot of immigrants that have decided that the United States is the place where they do want to carry out their innovations. So if you think about then the strategy for the EU, the goal should be to harness the best tech talent around the world and make sure that talent wants to migrate to Europe. What would it take? So first of all, we need to have a greater investment in our universities. If you look at the statistics ranking the best universities around the world, and look at one of the most sort of often referred to statistics that just rank 50 best universities around the world. 6 of those are from the European Union, the best one being number 32. That is not what the innovation culture needs. The second is that these universities that could be harnessing that global talent would also ensure that that global talent often would stay in Europe and innovate also in Europe and for Europe. So if you look at, for instance, American startups that are worth over 1 billion, over 50% of those have an immigrant founder. Over 50% have an immigrant founder. And if we just look at the most successful of those American tech companies, you think about Apple and the founder Steve Jobs, who is a son of a Syrian immigrant. If you take Amazon, Jeff Bezos is a second-generation Cuban immigrant. Let's take Google. The founder, Sergey Brin, is from Russia, and the co-founder of Facebook, Eduardo Saverin, is Brazilian. So there are many examples how America has managed to harness the best talent of the world. And that, to me, is one of the crucial parts of the strategy for the EU as well. And let me now maybe end with the final thing that I would want Europe to focus on and take us back to the first question and the idea of whether we have an American techno-libertarian model, the Chinese digital authoritarian model, or the European more rights-based humanitarian model that is prevailing. I would say that the biggest battle that we are fighting is the battle of whether our digital future will be supporting, reinforcing, or whether it will be undermining a liberal democracy. And there I would say that teaming up with the United States to make sure that we will rein in China's exportation of its own digital authoritarian model is absolutely key. And our disagreements with the United States pale in comparison to the stakes in the battle over a democratic foundation for the internet, or lack thereof. So I put a lot of hope in the new Trade and Technology Council that has been set up between the EU and the US, and really hope that both sides will make a sincere investment to look at ultimately what are the key values that we are fighting for when we think about the future of technology. So there's much more to be said, but I would love to move on to questions and see where those take our conversation. But thank you again for the opportunity to weigh in.
Thank you very much, Anu. Vais a permitir que hable un poco en español y así descansa una de las traductoras y puede trabajar la otra.
These presentations are really interesting, and we have two important aspects to bear in mind. Spain and the European Union cannot be passive. It has to be a leading actor, and it has to put the European value at the center. It has been mentioned, and I wanted to start with the first question for the State Secretary and its vision, the law aspects and also the market regulations aspect. She has been a businesswoman, and she has been at the head of a department very important for Europe. And if Europe, I'm sure that Europe is the best place to be a citizen, but I don't know whether it is the best place to have a startup or a large company. I don't know whether Spain is the best place, because we have the States on the other side. And how can we change for the European Union to have everything we want? Spain has to catch up, of course, but it has been mentioned by Anne. One of the major assets of Europe is the exporting talent. We have been exporting talent. We have done that to create companies at a global level. For example, in the artificial intelligence, for example, it happened in the year 2014 when we launched the company that was called DeepMind. It creates the first algorithm of deep learning and launching the AI as we know it today. It was a European company founded by 14 professors of the UK. And in 2014, no fund wanted to invest that they did not know that existed. So it would have been very important because it was bought by Google, and it wasn't bought by a European company. It's a pity because Europe hasn't been looking where it has to look. So, but of course, the situation is changing. In the case of Spain, we know that that Spain is lagging behind, and we know that we are going to change the situation. But also from the European Fund, Spain is the member state that's going to allocate the greatest number of funds. So what do we have to change? We have to start creating startups. We are doing that with the Startup Act, and we have to create the environment to develop talent. It is the greatest structure. It is the talent economy and of the capacities. In Spain, we are among the best network of broadband in Europe. And we have to build the big structure of the country, the talent structure and innovation structure. Because in Spain, the entrepreneur is a hero and the innovator is a genius. We have a lot of genius and heroes, but we need a system to reproduce this success. At European level, we are in the same situation, and it has been mentioned in Europe. It has been very difficult to create unicorns because the lack of funding. Last week we created the fund Next Tech with 4 billion of euros of public-private funds to have scale up. Scale-up is a problem in Europe because a lot of funds are dedicated to startup, but when they grow, they do not found in Europe the funding to become a larger company. So they are going to be sold to American funds, Japanese fund, Chinese fund, and then the talent is drained away. And Spain, it is the second country of all Europe with the greatest contribution of scale-up. France, 2,000, Italy, 1,500. And from Europe, we want to have a fund of European funds. To say not only to have the 4 billions, but to have the 20, 30,000 billions we could have. And this is the key issue for this European coordination of the digital policy, where it has been defined. We call about the European compass, and Europe has shown clearly that she is needed, and we have showed it with the different actions deployed during the pandemic, and now we are going to be a key player in the definition of this future that hasn't been written yet. Thierry Breton has mentioned that have we lost the battle of data? All the data that we have currently represents only 20% of the data that will exist in 2025. 80% of the data that will exist in 2025 have yet to be created. And in this 80% to be created, 50% will come not only for the by the individuals, but the things, Internet of Things and things among things. So the growth of the data comes from the industrial part. So maybe we have lost the battle of the data, personal data, but we haven't lost the battle for the industrial data. So therefore, I'm fully convinced that the old Greece had an advantage because it is the cradle of democracy. But now Europe is going to have the power of the decision. During the pandemic, all my friends of Silicon Valley, when they told them not to go to the offices until 2022, they all left the States. They're working for the companies of the States, from the Canary Island, from Mallorca, from Santander, from Valencia, because we have a life quality, lifestyle that has to be protected, and we have to make these advantages ours. And Europe has all the advantage to be a major player. We are doing that for only part of the digital rights. We say that technology is not good at any kind of price, but we have to constrain technology. But we have to use technology for two things. One, the social and territorial articulation, and also to reduce the gap. If we do not use this technology to implement the changes we need to be competitive at global level, and if we do not use it to reduce the gap, then technology will be an inequality factor. But I think we can just reduce this gap. And the chart of the digital rights that was presented, the charter, Spain wants to participate in that proposal. So by that I say that these individual and collective rights that have cost us a lot during centuries from the social point of view, the rights of society, we do not want to lose those rights in the digital world. So therefore we have to revisit the rights we have, how we can interpret them, the right to intimacy, how we interpret in the digital world the freedom of expression, but also we are having another rights in other spheres we haven't developed. But the AI right or not to be discriminated by an algorithm. And Spain is the first country that has it on the Rider Act, the use and abuse of the digital platform. We have the concept of algorithmic transparency. So we are proposing a certain number of innovative rights in the neuro technologies that are not invasive, that are not regulated by medicine, but more by the electrical appliances. So it gives the right to a person not to be intervened, and for example, the wave of a company. Things that are part of science fiction, but they are happening. Our generation is a transition generation to technological transformation, a world that is not working anymore, and a world that has to be defined. We have two responsibilities with the future generation. I think that we have to address two large problems. On the one side, the climate change. If we do not solve it, this regeneration, there will be a world in the future. And the second one, to have to solve the ethical issues linked to the AI and other technologies. If we do not do that, if we do not regulate the technology with this balance in between innovation and no innovation, if we do not regulate this technology, there won't be a second round, because technology is going to be there and will go beyond the human rights and individual rights. This is our proposal, and we think that Europe has a lot to give, and that's why we are here.
Thank you, Karma. We have a question from Nacho Torreblanca that couldn't join us after all the work he carried out. He's the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations in Madrid. And his question...
First question is for Anu Bradford. Anu, are you still there? The question is about the Brussels effect. How else? The Brussels effect was most effective with the GDPR when the US was not paying attention. But do you think this time the US will allow the EU to have such a massive impact on their industries at a moment in which they're engaged in a fierce geopolitical competition with China?
So thank you. I think that's a terrific question. And it is true that it was very difficult for the US to compete when it came to setting privacy standards. There is no federal privacy law still today in the United States. Instead, what we've seen is many individual US states have been adopting, California most prominently, a very GDPR style or inspired regulation. But whether the US actually would want to enter this race and try to be the standard setter instead of the EU or find ways to push back, I think it's less clear. So if anything, the conversation in the United States is turning towards abandoning some of the more extreme techno-libertarian models, and the conversation about where we should be going when it comes to competition law, How should we think about moderating the conversations that take place online by these platforms? The rhetoric is starting to match much more what the EU is doing. So if anything, the US is not forcefully asserting a model that is so different from what the Europeans doing, but moving towards the European model. So I think it was striking that when the EU, for instance, the Commission unveiled its new proposal for the regulation of artificial intelligence, the first comment was from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor for President Biden, saying how the US welcomes this regulation and looks forward to working with like-minded allies like the EU on the regulation of the AI. So in many ways, I would say that we will see a much more of a foundation for cooperation between the US and the EU. And I would really sort of take the AI as a good test case for that. So the AI conversation that is taking place, and this is something that Ulrike was referring to in her remarks, the big report that came out of the US National Security Council on AI was very focused on the geopolitics of the AI. But the US is a long way from articulating the kind of detailed regulatory approach that the Europeans are putting forward. So I don't see a real competitor to the way we regulate the AI that would be asserted by the United States. So that might be another area where I expect some degree of Brussels effect taking place, especially if you think about how the more data you have, typically the better algorithms you can train. And if the Europeans go ahead with their own regulation, the global companies would need to face a choice and retrain the algorithms separately for different markets and not deploying the valuable big European data that they have at their disposal. So I think that's another example where I don't see the dynamic evolving, where the US would be in a position or even necessarily would want to push back on what the EU is doing.
Thank you, Anu. Ulrike, I'd like to comment more on technological sovereignty, that it's a topic that has come up. I think was the Commissioner the first one mentioning it. Can we achieve this on our own in Europe? Is this a realistic goal?
Well, as usual, that very much depends on what technological sovereignty even means, right? I actually, this fits in quite nicely because I wanted to come back to one point that Anu touched upon in her initial remarks, because she briefly warned about protectionism and not going down the road of protectionism. And I think there are some signs that this is something to be worried about. Another term used in this context is AI nationalism. There's a great essay on the topic, but I think this is one of those geopolitical developments that we need to keep an eye on. And this is linked to European digital sovereignty to some extent, as one thing we need to make sure is that European technological sovereignty doesn't just mean protectionism or technological nationalism, but on the European scale. It's not better just because you go from the national level to the European level and from one country to 27, and that's still not a great development. So that's just something to keep in mind. I'm not saying that that's necessarily where we're going, but I think whenever we talk about European technological sovereignty, European technological autonomy, all of this is something to keep in mind. Can we achieve this? Again, I mean, for me, whether it's technological sovereignty or strategic sovereignty, which goes beyond and is also in the military realm, for me, these terms basically describe a situation where you are able to choose your partners and choose your dependencies. No one is completely independent. I mean, the US aren't independent. China isn't independent. Like, no one is completely independent on anything. And I don't think that's necessarily something we want. There's a reason why there's global trade, international trade, where we work with others. But I think sovereignty means that you kind of choose where you are dependent on others, where you work with others, and where not, and where you want your own capabilities. And that's definitely something I think we need to think more about, and we can think more about. It's not going to be autonomy and the idea of autarky, where again you don't need anyone at all, but choosing your strategic dependencies in the technological realm is definitely something that we need to do and that we can do, but it's going to be an ongoing process. I mean, we will never have a situation where we're going to say, now we've achieved technological sovereignty, so that's done. That's not how this works, right? This is a process, and as technology develops and as you know, our needs develop, you kind of need to adjust and adapt yourself to that. But I do consider this a worthy goal that kind of puts our discussion into the right direction.
Just let me add a point on this concept of digital sovereignty. It doesn't mean that we just want to eliminate all competitors or digital companies in the state and just work in protectionism with European companies and digital corporates. So, for example, the original idea to create a European cloud is something that I have never thought it was feasible, in the sense that you, of course, need to have alternatives. When you need to choose, it's because you have an alternative. And what happens is that we don't have a European alternative to many of the services providers. And therefore is when we realize that Europe needs to rethink what are their national reserves, their national strategic capacities, or their national, I mean continental. And for example, I don't mean that Google, Amazon, and Microsoft cannot be the European providers. Of course they should be, because there is no European alternative. And if we start building it now, it will be 15 years later, and it will provide the same services at the same price. But what happens is that we should develop our own skills on cloud. We probably, with the Gaia X or the IPC project, are building our own infrastructure, mostly, for example, for public data or critical data. But what we want to define is the way these global clouds operate in Europe. And that's our right. And we want absolutely self-control and autonomy on the ways these clouds operate. And for me, it's very important what we are doing now in defining data flows, free data flows between Europe and UK, data flows between Europe and third parties, because that's where we are really playing the big game. For me, data flows have to do, so the digital sovereignty requires data sovereignty. And my view is that data should be resident. Data from European people should be resident in European soil, processed in European data centers and in clouds which can be managed in the European way, the European requirements. And I give you an example. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't exchange data for a single digital market or exchange data for transactions and e-commerce. That doesn't mean that. It means, for example, what has happened during the pandemic. All of a sudden, all the schools had to become e-learning schools. No? They required e-learning platforms. And the big players have provided free software and free e-learning platforms to all the schools in Europe. Where are our children's data? So in some server in the United States, in whatever parts out of Europe, a lot of copies, a lot of backups of our children's data. What happens if my child had suffered from bullying when he was 13 years old? Will that affect his scoring when he becomes 25 and he registers in LinkedIn? These are the type of questions we are not addressing, but are the important ones. How can we protect our children from their data to be distributed or segmented or micro-targeted, or having a social scoring of your child outside Europe? And that's what we want to preserve. So for me, it's very important that we find the rules, how data should be exchanged, how data should be processed, and how European, worldwide, commercial clouds should operate in Europe. And Europe is such an important market that nobody will renounce to it. And I'm sure the same way that everybody was reluctant in the beginning but had to adapt to GDPR, if we define some rules on how data should be stored, processed, and how clouds should be governed, and that's the aim of the Data Act, I think that's the way to go.
If I can maybe add one super short point, just because I think it's really important, your point about European alternatives, because you mentioned DeepMind earlier, and I was thinking that, so the problem with DeepMind, this kind of London-founded AI firm that was later on bought by Google or Alphabet, I don't think the primary problem for DeepMind was that they couldn't find European funders or finance. I mean, people like Jan Tallinn invested quite early, but DeepMind could not have done the research it went on to do with AlphaGo, etc., if it hadn't been bought by Alphabet and by Google, and if it couldn't have used their data to improve their own AI. And so basically what I'm saying is that for DeepMind, there was no European alternative, and this is why it went.
Anu, do you want to comment on that? You mentioned the problem with funding for EU companies to get bigger, but is it only funding, or is it also the same regulation that is protecting citizens? Is it being an obstacle for companies to grow? We can hear you, sorry.
Sorry, I just realized that I was muted. I am sorry about that. So I did emphasize funding, but I also many other factors that are part of the ecosystem. So I think it all needs to come together for Europe to be successful. So I don't think funding alone. It's always how much of the innovation and how innovative, how much ambition there is to, for instance, for that funding then to be put into good use in the EU. So I certainly wouldn't like to overemphasize that. And I agree with a lot of the issues that Carmen was just mentioning on the way that we need to also ensure that we have the kind of regulatory frameworks that do enable the kind of innovation where we want to excel. So I would actually think that the AI regulation, the new proposal, has an absolutely right approach, that it's not trying to choose between, that we either regulate, we either defend our values, or we will be pursuing excellence. And in many ways, I think the fine line there, and we've been trying to draw it when it comes to protecting European interests and protectionism, is that can we make sure that we are open, we let different players to process data, that the data wouldn't need to be processed in the EU, but it would need to be processed according to European standards, and make sure that we can enforce those safeguards, so that the innovation, not just in Europe, but innovation that affects Europeans, is done according to European standards.
Okay, I think everybody here nodded, so I think there's an agreement on the table. And vamos a abrir ahora el tiempo de preguntas en la sala. Me están llegando más preguntas de las personas que están siguiéndolo online, pero si queréis en la sala hacer alguna pregunta, este es el momento de levantar la mano. Veo un par de manos, os acercan el micrófono ahora mismo.
Hi, my name is John Leraski, and I have a question for Anu. My question is, what's your view on the
Hola, tengo una pregunta para Anu.
that the EU is creating to get competitive?
So, first of all, thank you for the question. And the industrial alliances are pretty much the only way forward, because if you think about European Union's budget, it is not designed to fund alone big industrial policy and innovation projects. So if the EU's budget is about 1% of its GDP, you cannot compete with what Chinese government is funding, or let's say America, where the federal budget is about 20% of their GDP. So in that sense, the only path forward is that the role of the EU is that it can catalyze investment into these technologies and harness the funding from the member states and then from the industry. So as the design for these the various industrial policy initiatives, I think it is the right way to go. And the public-private partnerships are the right pathway forward. But I would bring back what I mentioned earlier, is that the fact alone that we have an industrial alliance is not a guarantee for success. So a lot depends on what this will ultimately amount to. And what I would not want to say is that it is just a way to try to enter into a subsidy race with the other leading governments, or then to make sure that this is not part of the bigger industrial strategy that would compromise the European commitment to openness. But in principle, I think it is an absolutely right way forward, and I am really happy to see the EU do that. I just hope it will be well selected, well carried out, and ultimately effective to pursue the kind of goals that are in line with the European values, and also then really maximize the innovative potential.
Thank you, Anu. There is another question. Hay otra pregunta al fondo de la sala.
Muy buenas tardes. Gracias a las señoras ponentes y también en especial a la señora Carmen Ática por su empresa.
To thank Carmen Artigas for her success as a businesswoman and in the digitalization program. First of all, Carmen Artigas has said something very important regarding talent, innovation, and so on and so forth. But Spain needs to solve before a serious problem that it has for this talent to increase and to be developed, and that takes some time. And that is the horrible education system we have in Spain, because it doesn't matter where, we are not happy as citizens of the present and future of our youngsters. It is true there is a problem in the labor market, but then also we have the issue, I don't know if measures have been put in place, but to reduce the fiscal pressure, because entrepreneurs not only need aids or being able to create a company, they have to get support little by little to continue employing and expanding the company. My second quick question is for Anu Bradford, and it has to do with a fundamental issue to be able to compete in globalization against the other big colossus as China and the US, without forgetting, which I believe will be the great power in the future, India. And that is that Europe has clearly said that it has to attack and defend, but I believe in a game to participate you need good players, but you cannot be the referee and the player. You need to either attack or defend, to ally with one side or the other. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to the Secretary of State. Well, thank you. You've asked a question around a fundamental issue, which are the skills in Spain. To be able to compete, we need digital skills, and in the same manner that I was saying that Spain is the second country in telecommunications, we are below the average in two elements, which is the lack of digital skills in the citizenship. 43% of the Spanish citizens don't have the basic digital skills, and the lack of digitalization of our SMEs. These two issues have to be changed urgently, and that's why in the recovery plan, Spain is going to allocate 3 billion to the national digital skills plan, and more than 4 billion to the digitization of SMEs. Specifically, in the first plan, the plan on digital skills, we need to address two things. First of all, we need to solve the problem of lack of digital skills, but we also need to reform our education model. And part of this budget will go to the reform of primary, secondary education, and mainly BET. We, in the ministers, we approved big data, cybersecurity, and other elements to be included in vocational education and training, and in ongoing training and universities. But it's not enough. We also need skilling and reskilling of the already existing labor force. We need to train our unemployed in digital skills so that they have more opportunities. This is what we want to do with this plan. At the same time, we also need to invest in training specialists, because these new opportunities generate a need of specialists, and we can find ourselves in the paradox that we have structural unemployment and we don't have 2 million jobs that cannot be covered without the skills. So we need to work on the short, middle, and long term at the same time. And the recovery funds will allow us to do so. And the reality, and there's 4 more times demand of this specialist than what we have in Spain. Company says, if I will find the talent in the country, I could generate 500, 1,000 jobs. We have identified the need. The recovery plans take it into account, and all the government's effort to be able to progress in this direction. And regarding fiscal incentives, we just closed the startups projects where we talk about different tax incentives for business angels and other elements. And on yesterday, the law CREA y Crece, create and grow, that affects technological startups, but all businesses in general, was passed by the cabinet. So reforms are being put in place to be able to have a better environment to create businesses in Spain. But let's not forget that Spain doesn't want to not have a public income. We need to bear that in mind too. Karma, 2 more questions.
And it's your turn. I don't know. Did you hear the question? Anu? There was a question from the public for you?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have the translation, so I would need to ask you to kindly maybe summarize it to me in English, if you don't mind.
Sure. ¿Podría repetirla, por favor?
Sí, puedo repetirla. Sí.
Brevemente.
Muy breve. Ha mencionado usted que Europa
that Europe should become a referee, but at the same time attack and defend to become the 3rd sector of world digital globalization. But in such an important game like this one for history, you first of all need quality players to be able to compete in that specific league. But you are either an attacker or a referee. You cannot be a player and a referee at the same time. I don't know if you understood what I'm saying. You cannot be on both sides at the same time. And you mean China and the US? Yes. Because everyone is going to say, you either on one side or the other.
Should Europe be a referee? Battle between China and the US. I think we've already mentioned some of that, but should Europe attack or defend, following the football metaphor, or how can EU deal with the US-China conflict in technological geopolitics? And how do you say?
So that's something that I thought to articulate, that being a referee is an important role. I don't want to take anything away from that, but I mentioned that the EU should also get in the field and play the game, and play both, as you suggest, defense and offense. So I think that the offensive strategies are exactly the kind of industrial alliances that the previous question was about, extensive investment into building those capabilities, because that's the key for the EU to actually be also the originator of those technologies. So absolutely, I would think that the EU should not only be a referee, it shouldn't abandon its commitment to be a decisive and influential rule maker, but it should also seek to be building those technologies in a way that is true to its openness and that does not move Europe towards more techno-nationalist industrial policy. And I also highlighted earlier a few of those defensive instruments that I think are very important, including making sure that the critical, strategically relevant technology assets will not get acquired without a close review by various foreign acquirers. So, in short, it should not only be a referee, even though that is also an important role.
Okay, thank you. I know you made your point clear. Thank you very much. We have time for a couple of more questions, but before I give you the floor, let me ask Carmen Artigas 2 questions very briefly. I just got them in Spanish. En este debate entre protección y apertura en relación a la soberanía tecnológica de la que estábamos hablando, ¿cuál es la posición de España? Y siguiendo con esto, ¿ve necesaria algún tipo de coordinación y colaboración con las comunidades autónomas?
Collaborate and coordinate with the autonomous communities for this strategy. Luque Uribe Echevarría, a senator from the Basque PNV party, is the one asking this question, and he's following all the talks. So we would like to know what your view is on this. Can you hear me? Hello? Yes, the deployment of the recovery plan in Spain and of the digital agenda 2025 that includes the different plans like the SMEs, 5G, connectivity, broadband. It of course will require to work and collaborate with the autonomous communities, and we're already deploying this. No doubt in things like digital skills, autonomous communities will have their action sphere as they have in other areas. Like technology shows us that you cannot work in silos. You cannot reduce the pandemic to the data of your region and try to control the pandemic model at a global level. We have to, with technology, work in a network and escalate. We need to understand that projects are global and solutions too. What we've learned in Spain is that you have data that have to be shared, and if not, you won't have trustworthy data. So you need to have the adequate data with governance mechanisms that share the data and the solutions. We've recently appointed the first chief data officer of the Spanish government that will be working in an intense manner with the autonomous communities to decide on our patterns to share data between the public administrations, also the public administrations with the private sector, and how the private sector can exchange also data between them and then escalate this to the European level. So collaboration is necessary and essential because you can delegate or abdicate. You can delegate the execution because those that are closer to the individuals are the ones putting that in place, but you also need to have a global view of the information that provides an added value. So if you give me one part and I give you the global vision, we will have better insights for decision making. Thank you.
We've got another question about the impact of...
Ulrike, tenemos otra pregunta en cuanto a artificial y democracia.
And the cybersecurity you've mentioned before. And how can we link this topic with the rivalry between the West and the East?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the question. Democracy and AI, but here I would even go broader and talk about digital technologies and specifically, social media, I think is a huge topic, and it hasn't gone the way that we hoped it would, but also thought it would. You may remember when Bill Clinton was president, he very much believed that bringing the internet to countries such as China would basically mean that they had to become more open, more democratic, because people would be more involved in the democratic discourse. And he famously said that trying to control the internet is like trying to nail pudding to the wall or something like that. And we had a similar narrative during the Arab Spring, the so-called Facebook revolutions or Twitter revolutions, where it was also this idea that, this opportunity of being able to express yourself on the internet in the digital realm helps the democratic discourse. Well, fast forward a few years, and we don't have the Arab Spring, but the run of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., which arguably was very much fueled by discussions on social media. So I think there's definitely a bigger danger that these technologies pose to democracy than we initially thought. And unfortunately, at the same time, we're seeing the other side of the medal, where we can very much see that technologies, and here it really is specifically artificial intelligence, very much help to bolster authoritarian regimes. I mean, surveillance technologies and AI-enabled surveillance technologies can really create absolutely horrifying surveillance states, and we see the first developments of this in China and elsewhere, but it can go much further, very much, you know, into the Big Brother world. And so it seems to me that AI can really supercharge a few of these threats. I mean, be it surveillance technologies, disinformation is another one. I mean, obviously disinformation predates all of these technologies that we're talking about by century, if not millennia, but AI can definitely supercharge disinformation, for example, through deep fakes, these fake videos and things like that. And so I think our response is partly technological as well. You know, you can debunk deep fake disinformation with the help of technology, but that only gets you so far, because again, you know, disinformation was there before that and feeds on different things that aren't just technological. So in the end, you need a kind of all of government and all of society approach to fight this. But unfortunately, I basically share the concern, and I don't have a great answer, because we're really seeing developments that are concerning for democracies and quite helpful, it seems, to authoritarian regimes. So that's one of the elements, the social, and then through this also geopolitical developments that we need to keep an eye on. But I don't have a great answer on how exactly we will be able to solve it.
So one of the beauties of this meeting is that I have now the chance to work with you, because we have just launched in Spain an agreement to build the first chair on AI and democracy together with the European University in Florence, led by Daniel Inerarity. So we're really focused on analyzing all the implications between AI and democracy, as you mentioned, fake news, creating lack of trust of people and new risks. And of course, I think we can find common ground for collaboration.
What are, according to your research, Ulrike, what are the biggest threats you've seen in surveillance states that perhaps the Secretary of State might want to take notes of it?
I guess it's difficult to really classify, because it depends on, how do you define biggest threats? Is it the kind of the most horrifying examples? There are some efforts of trying to predict homosexuality by, facial recognition, which is, a terrible approach, and B, you can imagine how this can be basically instrumentalized. So that's obviously terrifying, but at the same time, I'm basically almost more terrified by the stuff that's already really prevalent, right? The AI-enabled, quite ubiquitous surveillance that we hear is happening in some parts of China is something that I would argue is a big threat, because it's already very much here. And I mentioned that, I work a lot on, the impact of artificial intelligence and other technologies on the military realm. And everyone always asks me, like, oh, what about killer robots? What about the Terminator? And yes, I share a lot of concerns about autonomous weapons. But I also always say, one thing is, a potential development that we're seeing, but isn't quite there, and there is no Terminator yet, or maybe may never be. But at the same time, we have really concerning things in the realm of surveillance technology. So I think it really depends on how you define the biggest threat. But there are several things that are already happening that we really need to keep an eye on, and that keep me up at night a bit more than the Terminator, as scary as that future is.
Thank you very much. There was a couple of questions. Sí, por favor, si le podéis acercar el micrófono. Estupendo, muchas gracias. Y ya vamos a ir terminando con... ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta en la sala? Vamos a ir terminando con esta. Por favor.
This is hello. This is a question for Anu Bradford about what you talked of the Brussels effects in the field of artificial intelligence. I would like to know do you think that these Brussels effects could work as well in the environmental for setting environmental standards? I'm thinking about the external, to promote the external dimension of the Green New Deal that is launched now very strongly by the European Commission. For example, with this carbon border adjustment mechanism, do you think that this could work in the same way as in the artificial intelligence field? How the climate diplomacy should complement the implementation of these Brussels effects? This is more or less my.
Great, thank you. I think it's a terrific question, and very much if I need to highlight what are the priorities, as I see it, of this Commission and the EU right now, it is the digital transformation, and it is to advance the sustainability agenda to fight climate change. And I think the Brussels effect can be a very successful tool, at least among the several tools that the EU can deploy to make sure that the fight to halt climate change will indeed be global. So there are already examples of how the Brussels effect has been harnessed to advance many environmental goals. So if we think about the safety of chemicals, that is critical for human health, but also for our environment, the Brussels effect has been absolutely key to make sure that the practices of several industries have become much more sustainable, whether we talk about animal welfare or whether we think about the emissions trading scheme, a key element of the EU's fight against climate change. So we already see in the environmental domain a lot of Europe's regulatory influence having gone global. And now I would say that as part of the Green Deal, and there are so many different initiatives that then together make up the Green Deal, that some of them are definitely those where the EU is in a position to transform the global regulatory practices. And you highlight the one that is probably the most significant and that the world is watching very closely, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So that is something where we will again see most likely that the companies are adjusting in how they produce products, because they know that if they want to access the European market, they will be held to the European standards in terms of the carbon that they need to pay for. So this most likely, and I hope to see that the Europeans don't even need to resort to the border tax as often, or the adjustment mechanism, because the governments in different parts of the world will take this as an invitation to adopt the domestic climate policies that will then spare their companies from having to pay the carbon adjustment on the border when exporting into the EU. So that's, I think, a prime example where we see a tremendous potential to have a global shift towards more sustainable and climate neutral practices. But that's only one of them. If we think about the ETS also, to expanding the scope of the emissions trading scheme is also an invitation to think more ambitiously, not just in the EU, but around the world. So I consider that to be one of those policies that is rightly a priority. It's rightly one where the EU is more assertive, especially the border tax, the border adjustment is probably going to be controversial. Some war that it will lead into a trade war, but it's one of those where the EU can design it in a way that is consistent with international trade rules and that would withstand any scrutiny in the WTO. So it's one of those good fights that are worth fighting for, and I think your question is terrific and very, very important, so I'm happy that we had a chance to weigh in on that too.
Thank you very much, Anu. We're running out of time, nos estamos quedando sin tiempo, así que vamos a ir concluyendo. Muchísimas gracias a todos. Ha sido una sesión muy completa. Hemos hablado de geopolítica, hemos hablado de la Unión Europea, hemos hablado, por supuesto, de democracia y de los valores de la Unión Europea.
It's about democracy and the values of the European Union.
De mañana por la mañana, la que
And that's what we are going to address tomorrow morning, the value, the democracy, and the role played by the EU. I thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias, Anu.
Un placer. Gracias a todos.